Hello everyone. Welcome to Mr. Midnight True Crime Stories. I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep. So before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. There is a particular kind of fear that arrives not with a stranger's face, but with a familiar smile. It doesn't announce itself with broken windows or dark alleyways. It walks through the front door. It sits across from you at dinner. It knows your routines, your vulnerabilities, your secrets. This fear wears the mask of trust, and that is precisely what makes it so devastating. Tonight, we're going to spend time together exploring 5 stories that share this uncomfortable truth. These are not tales of random violence or chance encounters with evil. These are stories about the people we let into our lives, the ones we believe would never hurt us, and the terrible moments when that belief is shattered beyond repair. Each story is different in its details, but they are bound together by a single thread that runs through all of them like a dark river beneath seemingly solid ground. We often tell ourselves that danger is obvious, that we would recognize it, that our instincts would sound an alarm before anything terrible could happen. We imagine violence as loud and sudden, perpetrated by strangers with cruel intentions written plainly on their faces. But the truth is far more unsettling. The truth is that most harm comes from proximity, from intimacy, from the gradual erosion of boundaries that happens so slowly we don't notice until it's far too late. Think about the people you trust most in this world, the ones you would call in an emergency, the ones who have keys to your home, who know when you're alone, who understand your patterns and your fears. For most of us, these relationships form the foundation of our lives. They are what make us feel safe in an uncertain world. But what happens when that foundation cracks? What happens when the person you trusted most becomes the person you should have feared? These 5 stories will take us through different landscapes of betrayal. We'll meet a young woman whose trust in an older mentor led her into isolation and then into silence. We'll enter a home where a child disappeared while police searched the very rooms where she lay hidden. We'll witness a father killed by his own daughter's hand, a teacher murdered by the husband who promised to love her, and a good Samaritan executed for doing the right thing. Each story carries its own weight, its own particular heartbreak. As you settle in tonight, whether you're listening in the dark hours of early morning or as evening fades into night, I want you to know that these stories are told with respect. The people we'll talk about were real. They had lives that mattered, dreams that went unfulfilled, families that still carry the weight of their absence. We're not here to sensationalize their suffering or to turn tragedy into entertainment. We're here to remember, to understand, and perhaps to recognize the warning signs that others missed. The night ahead is long, and these stories will unfold slowly, deliberately. There's no rush here. We have time to examine the details, to sit with the uncomfortable questions, to understand not just what happened, but how it was allowed to happen. So take a breath, settle into wherever you are, and let's begin this journey together. Our first story takes us to a place where trust was cultivated like a garden, tended carefully over months and years until it bloomed into something that looked like love, but was actually a trap. Emily Hartwell was 19 years old when she vanished from the small market town of Northmere. To understand what happened to Emily, we need to understand who she was before she became a headline, before her name became synonymous with a mystery that would haunt her family and challenge investigators in ways they never anticipated. Northmere was the kind of town where people still left their doors unlocked, where Friday night football games drew half the population, where everyone knew everyone else's business whether they wanted to or not. It sat in a valley surrounded by rolling farmland, with a main street that boasted exactly one stoplight, a hardware store that had been there for 3 generations, and a diner where the waitresses knew your order before you sat down. It was picturesque in that particularly American way, the kind of place people from cities imagine when they dream about simpler lives. Emily had grown up in this landscape, but she had never quite fit into its narrow boundaries. While other girls her age were planning weddings or college majors, Emily was writing songs. She carried a battered notebook everywhere, filled with lyrics that tried to capture feelings she couldn't quite express in ordinary conversation. Her songs were melancholic, introspective, full of longing for something she couldn't name. Her mother found this concerning. Her father found it embarrassing. Her younger brother found it weird. The Hartwell household was not an easy place to be different. Emily's father worked long hours at the grain elevator outside of town, coming home tired and irritable, wanting quiet and order. Her mother had given up her own dreams years ago and seemed to resent anyone who still had theirs. Family dinners were tense affairs punctuated by silences that felt heavier than words. Emily learned early to keep her thoughts to herself, to smile when expected, to not make waves. But the songs kept coming. She would stay up late in her small bedroom, headphones on, writing and rewriting verses that never felt quite right, but were getting closer to something true. She posted a few of them online, acoustic recordings made on her phone, and was surprised when people she'd never met left comments saying her words had made them feel less alone. This was what she wanted, she realized. Not fame exactly, but connection. The ability to touch someone else's heart with honesty. It was this desire for connection that made her vulnerable to Marcus Hale. Marcus was 43 when he met Emily, though he wore his age well. He was married to a woman named Catherine, a marriage that from the outside appeared stable, if not passionate. He worked as a financial advisor, managing investments for the town's wealthier residents, which meant he understood people's secrets, their fears about money and security and the future. He was considered trustworthy, respectable, the kind of man you could rely on. He was also the kind of man who knew how to recognize need in others and exploit it. They met at a community event, one of those forced gatherings that small towns specialize in, where attendance is less about enjoyment and more about maintaining social standing. Emily was there reluctantly, dragged by her mother who believed that her daughter's reclusiveness was a problem that needed fixing. Marcus was there because his wife insisted, because it was good for business to be seen. He noticed Emily standing apart from the clusters of conversation, her expression distant, her fingers tapping rhythms on her thigh that suggested she was composing something in her head. He recognized that look. He had seen it before in other young people who felt trapped by the limitations of small-town life. And he knew exactly how to approach someone like that. "You look like you'd rather be anywhere else," he said, his tone conspiratorial, offering her a knowing smile. Emily looked up, startled. She didn't know this man. Though his face was vaguely familiar in that way, everyone's face was familiar in Northmere. "Is it that obvious?" she asked. "Only to someone who feels the same way," Marcus replied. "I'm Marcus. You're Emily Hartwell, right? I've seen you around. You're the one who writes songs." The fact that he knew this, that he had noticed her at all, sent a small thrill through her. In a town where she felt invisible, being seen felt like a gift. They talked for the rest of the evening, Marcus asking thoughtful questions about her music, her influences, her dreams. He listened in a way her parents never did, with genuine interest and without judgment. It felt like the beginning of a friendship, maybe even a mentorship. Marcus presented himself as someone who understood artistic ambition, who had once harbored creative dreams of his own before adult responsibilities had redirected his life. He told her he didn't want to see her make the same compromises, that her talent was too real to be wasted. Over the following weeks, their conversations continued. Marcus would find reasons to run into Emily at the coffee shop where she worked part-time, staying to chat during her breaks. He began texting her articles about songwriting, links to performances by artists he thought she'd appreciate, encouragement when she expressed doubt about her abilities. To Emily, who received little support at home, this attention felt validating, important. Her parents noticed the friendship and approved of it. Marcus Hale was a respected member of the community, married, stable, old enough to be a father figure rather than a romantic interest. If he was taking an interest in their difficult daughter, perhaps he could guide her toward more practical ambitions. They encouraged Emily to listen to his advice. What none of them recognized was the pattern Marcus was establishing. Every conversation, every text, every small gesture of support was a thread in a web he was carefully constructing. He was isolating Emily emotionally, becoming the only person who truly understood her, the only one she could talk to about what really mattered. He never made an inappropriate advance, never crossed a line that would trigger alarm. He was patient. By the time summer arrived, Emily had started to depend on Marcus in ways she didn't fully recognize. When she had a bad day, he was the person she texted. When she finished a new song, he was the first to hear it. When her parents frustrated her, which was often, he was the one who validated her feelings and reminded her that she wasn't crazy, that her dreams were legitimate. But something was beginning to shift. Marcus's texts were becoming more frequent, sometimes arriving late at night. His questions were becoming more personal. He wanted to know where she was, who she was with, what she was doing. When she mentioned other friends, he would subtly undermine them, pointing out their flaws, suggesting they didn't really understand her the way he did. Emily felt this shift, but didn't have the experience to name it. She told herself that Marcus was just being protective, that he cared about her well-being. When he suggested she delete their text conversations so her parents wouldn't misunderstand their friendship, she agreed without question. When he asked her to meet him at odd hours, in places away from town, she went because he framed it as necessary for her privacy, for protecting her from small-town gossip. The grooming was so gradual, so expertly executed, that Emily never saw it for what it was. By the time she began to feel uncomfortable, she was already caught. It was Marcus's brother Lucas who first noticed something was wrong. Lucas was 7 years younger than Marcus, 36, and worked as a mechanic in town. The brothers were not close. There had always been a rivalry between them. Marcus, with his education and white-collar career, looking down on Lucas's blue-collar life. Lucas resenting his brother's arrogance and carefully maintained image. Lucas first saw Emily with Marcus late one evening in July. They were sitting in Marcus's car in an empty parking lot behind the old textile mill, talking with an intensity that seemed inappropriate for what Marcus had described as a casual mentorship. Lucas mentioned it to Marcus the next day, framed as a joke, but there was an edge to it. "Saw you with the Hartwell girl last night. Bit young for you, isn't she?" Marcus's response was smooth, practiced. "I'm helping her with some career planning. She wants to pursue music, and her parents don't understand. Someone needs to encourage her, right?" Lucas said, not believing a word. "Just be careful, brother. People talk." But Marcus wasn't careful, because he didn't believe he was doing anything wrong. In his mind, he had a special connection with Emily, something pure that others wouldn't understand. He had convinced himself that he was helping her, that his feelings were paternal, mentorly, even as they were becoming something else entirely. Lucas couldn't shake his unease. He started paying more attention, and what he saw troubled him. He saw the way Marcus's eyes followed Emily when she walked past. He saw the possessiveness in how Marcus positioned himself near her at public events. He saw Emily becoming more withdrawn, more isolated, even as Marcus claimed to be helping her bloom. And then Lucas did something that would later save the investigation, even though it couldn't save Emily. He started documenting what he observed, keeping notes on his phone about when and where he saw them together, about the changes he noticed in Emily's demeanor. Emily, meanwhile, was beginning to realize she was in over her head. Marcus had started making comments about his marriage, about how his wife didn't understand him, about how Emily was different from every other woman he'd known. He had started touching her more, casual touches on her arm or shoulder that lingered too long, that made her skin crawl even as she told herself she was overreacting. She tried to create distance. She started responding to his texts less frequently, making excuses when he wanted to meet. But Marcus didn't accept boundaries well. When she pulled back, he pushed harder, his texts becoming more insistent, more emotional. He told her he had sacrificed things for their friendship, that she was being ungrateful, that she owed him at least the courtesy of an explanation. Emily found herself apologizing, trying to manage his feelings, falling back into the pattern he had established where his emotional needs took priority over her discomfort. This is what abuse does. It makes you responsible for your abuser's feelings, makes you believe that setting boundaries is a form of cruelty. It was in this state of confusion and growing fear that Emily met Lucas properly for the first time. Her car had broken down on the county road, and Lucas was the one who stopped to help. As he worked on her engine, they talked, and something in his kindness, so different from his brother's intense attention, made Emily relax slightly. "You doing okay?" Lucas asked, and the question was simple enough, but the way he asked it, with genuine concern and no expectation of a particular answer, made Emily's eyes well with tears. She didn't tell him everything, but she told him enough. That his brother's friendship had become overwhelming. That she didn't know how to step back without causing problems. That she felt trapped. Lucas listened without judgment. "Marcus can be a lot," he said carefully. "He's used to getting what he wants. But you don't owe him anything, Emily. You know that, right?" It was something she needed to hear, and in the weeks that followed, she found herself thinking about that conversation. Lucas started checking in on her occasionally, casual texts asking how she was doing. No pressure, no expectations. It was such a contrast to Marcus's demands that Emily found herself drawn to the simplicity of it. This, of course, made everything worse. When Marcus discovered that Emily was talking to Lucas, his reaction was immediate and frightening. He showed up at her house late one night, demanded to know what she was telling his brother, accused her of trying to ruin his life. Emily, terrified by this side of him she'd never seen, tried to calm him down, promised she hadn't said anything damaging. But Marcus's trust, once broken, could not be repaired. He became obsessive, tracking her movements, showing up at her work, sending her dozens of texts a day that swung between apology and accusation. Emily was terrified but didn't know who to tell. Who would believe that Marcus Hale, respected community member, was harassing her? And hadn't she participated in their friendship? Hadn't she met him in secret, deleted messages, kept everything hidden? She felt complicit in her own entrapment, which is exactly what Marcus had intended. It was late September when Emily told Marcus it had to stop. She did it over text, which she knew was cowardly, but she couldn't face him in person. She wrote that she appreciated everything he'd done for her, but their friendship had become unhealthy, and she needed space. She asked him to respect her boundaries and stop contacting her. Marcus's response was chilling in its calm. "I understand you're confused right now. We'll talk about this when you're thinking more clearly. I know you don't mean this." But Emily did mean it. For the first time in months, she felt certain about something. She blocked his number, blocked him on social media, told her manager at the coffee shop not to let him linger during her shifts. She started rebuilding connections with friends she'd neglected, started spending more time with Lucas in a relationship that was becoming something gentle and hopeful. For 2 weeks, Marcus stayed away, and Emily began to believe she was free. She was wrong. On the evening of October 11th, Emily finished her shift at the coffee shop at 9 o'clock. It was a Thursday, unremarkable in every way. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the smell of wood smoke from someone's fireplace. Main Street was quiet, most businesses already closed for the night. Emily walked to her car, a 10-year-old Honda Civic that she'd bought with money saved from 2 summers of work, unlocked it, and got inside. She sent a text to Lucas saying she was heading home, that she'd call him later. Lucas responded immediately with a thumbs-up emoji and a reminder to drive safe. It was the last message Emily would ever send. Her parents expected her home by 9:30. When 10 o'clock came and went with no sign of her, they weren't immediately worried. Emily was 19, after all, and sometimes she stopped to see friends or drove around listening to music, needing time alone before facing the tension of home. By 11, her mother was calling her phone. It rang through to voicemail. She tried again. Same result. By midnight, both parents were worried, but they told themselves there were reasonable explanations. Maybe her phone had died. Maybe she was at a friend's house and lost track of time. It wasn't until morning, when Emily's car was found in the coffee shop parking lot exactly where she'd left it, keys still in the ignition, her purse on the passenger seat with her phone inside, that real fear set in. Emily Hartwell had vanished. The initial police response was textbook for a missing person case involving a young adult. They checked local hospitals, reached out to known friends, reviewed her social media for any indication of plans or state of mind. Her parents, frantic now, provided access to everything, but there was nothing unusual. Emily's last posts were cheerful, showing no signs of distress or intention to run away. Interviews with friends painted a picture of a young woman who had been struggling earlier in the summer but had recently seemed happier, more like her old self. Lucas, when questioned, mentioned his brother's inappropriate friendship with Emily but was careful in how he described it, not wanting to make accusations without proof. Marcus, questioned as someone who knew the victim, was calm and helpful. He acknowledged their friendship, described it as mentorship, expressed shock and concern about her disappearance. He had an alibi for the evening she went missing. He'd been home with his wife, watching television, a quiet night in. Catherine confirmed this without hesitation. There was no physical evidence of foul play. Emily's car showed no signs of struggle. The parking lot cameras had been broken for months, a fact that seemed criminally negligent in retrospect, but was common in a small town where serious crime was rare. Days turned into a week. Search parties combed the woods around Northmere, volunteers from across the county showing up to walk grid patterns through forests and fields. Emily's face appeared on news broadcasts, on missing person posters stapled to every telephone pole, on social media feeds shared thousands of times with pleas for information. Her parents aged years and days, the hope in their eyes dying a little more each morning when their daughter didn't come home. They gave tearful interviews begging whoever had taken Emily to let her go, promising no questions, no prosecution, just please bring her home. But Emily was already beyond reach. It was the text messages that broke the case open, though not the ones anyone expected. 3 days after Emily's disappearance, her mother's phone buzzed with a message from Emily's number. The words made her cry out in relief. "Mom, I'm okay. I just needed to get away for a while. Please don't worry. I'll be in touch soon." The police were immediately skeptical. They'd had Emily's phone, found in her purse in her locked car. Someone else was using it now, or someone else had used it before abandoning it somewhere it was later found. But which scenario and why? A second message came 2 days later, this time to her father. "I'm safe. I'm with someone who cares about me. I know you won't understand, but this is what I need right now. Please respect my decision." The police asked to see these messages, and that's when the investigation shifted from missing person to probable homicide, because the detective who read those texts noticed something the Hartwells, desperate to believe their daughter was alive, had missed. The language was wrong. Emily was a songwriter, someone who chose words carefully, who had a distinctive voice in both her lyrics and her everyday communication. The detective, a woman named Sarah Chun who had read through hundreds of Emily's texts and social media posts, recognized immediately that these messages didn't match Emily's patterns of speech. Emily used contractions constantly. These messages didn't. Emily always signed her texts to her parents with a heart emoji. These messages had no emoji at all. Emily had a habit of over-apologizing, of softening statements with "I think" or "maybe." These messages were direct, almost cold. Most telling of all, Emily always spelled her mother's name as Mum in texts, a quirk she'd picked up from British YouTubers she followed. The message to her mother used Mom. Someone else had written these messages, someone who knew Emily well enough to approximate her voice, but not intimately enough to capture its nuances. Detective Chin brought in a forensic linguist, a specialist in analyzing written communication for authenticity. The linguist confirmed Chin's instincts. These messages were likely written by someone else attempting to simulate Emily's voice, probably a male in his 30s or 40s based on certain phrase constructions and formality of language. This analysis shifted everything. If someone was sending fake messages from Emily's phone, it meant they had her phone, which meant they'd had access to her car. And if they were trying to make it seem like Emily had left voluntarily, it suggested they were trying to hide the fact that she hadn't. The investigation intensified, focusing now on Emily's known associates, particularly those who might have a motive to harm her or make her disappear. Lucas's information about Marcus's obsessive friendship took on new significance. Police obtained warrants for Marcus's phone records, his computer, his financial statements. What they found was damning. Marcus had been monitoring Emily's location through a tracking app he'd convinced her to install months earlier, telling her it was for her safety when she drove alone at night. He told her he would only check if she didn't respond to messages, and he was worried. In reality, he checked it constantly, dozens of times a day, tracking her movements with obsessive precision. In the weeks before her disappearance, after Emily had cut off contact, Marcus's tracking had intensified. The app's data log showed him checking her location every few minutes during her work shifts, monitoring when she left, where she went. On the night she disappeared, the app showed him checking her location at 8:47 p.m., 8:53 p.m., 8:59 p.m., and then at 9:02 p.m., he was at the coffee shop parking lot. Emily's phone stopped transmitting location data at 9:08 p.m. His internet search history, recovered from his home computer, revealed a dark preoccupation. In the days after Emily blocked him, he'd searched for information about how long someone could survive without food or water, about remote cabin rentals in neighboring states, about how police track cell phones, about whether deleted text messages could be recovered. Most chillingly, he'd searched for articles about cases where people had been convicted of murder without a body being found. Marcus was arrested on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after Emily's disappearance. His wife Catherine watched in shock as police led him from their home in handcuffs. She had known nothing, she would later insist, about the depth of his obsession with Emily, about the lies he'd told, about the darkness he'd been hiding behind his respectable facade. In custody, Marcus maintained his innocence. Yes, he'd cared about Emily, perhaps too much, but he hadn't hurt her. He couldn't explain the phone location data except to suggest his phone's GPS must have been inaccurate. He couldn't explain his internet searches except to say he'd been worried about Emily and researching what might have happened to her. He had an explanation for everything, and none of the explanations held up under scrutiny. Investigators, working with the location data and Marcus's credit card records, traced his movements over the week following Emily's disappearance. He had rented a vehicle, a pickup truck, 2 days before she vanished, telling the rental company his own truck was in the shop. This rental truck had been returned with an additional 847 miles on the odometer, far more than would be expected for local use. Security footage from a gas station 200 miles north of Northmere showed Marcus filling up this truck at 3:17 a.m. on the night Emily disappeared. He was alone in the footage, and the truck bed was covered with a tarp. Following the route suggested by his credit card purchases, police identified several remote areas where Marcus had stopped, isolated stretches of national forest where a person could disappear and never be found. Search teams scoured these areas with dogs, ground-penetrating radar, drones. They found nothing. The case moved forward without Emily's body, built instead on the architecture of Marcus's obsession, his lies, his opportunity, and the phone records that placed him at the scene of her disappearance. The forensic linguist provided testimony about the fake messages, explaining how their stylistic markers pointed to Marcus as the likely author. The trial lasted 3 weeks and was covered extensively by media both local and national. It became a story about how predators hide in plain sight, about how grooming can happen slowly enough that victims don't recognize it until they're trapped, about how trust can be weaponized by those who understand human vulnerability. Emily's parents sat in the courtroom every day, holding hands, their faces carved with grief that would never fully heal. Lucas testified about his brother's possessiveness, his anger when Emily tried to pull away, his history of needing to control the people around him. Catherine testified too, describing a husband she realized she'd never truly known, a man who had compartmentalized his life so thoroughly that his own wife hadn't seen the monster he was becoming. Marcus took the stand in his own defense, a calculated risk that backfired spectacularly. Under cross-examination, his calm facade cracked. He spoke about Emily with a possessiveness that chilled the jury, referring to her as mine multiple times, insisting that she had loved him, that their connection was real and deep, that she would never have chosen to be with his brother if Marcus hadn't been trapped in a marriage he couldn't leave. The prosecution asked him directly, "Where is Emily Hartwell?" Marcus's response was quiet but clear, "I don't know." But everything else he'd said, the way he'd said it, suggested he was lying. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning a guilty verdict on charges of first-degree murder and kidnapping. Marcus Hale was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the sentence was read, he showed no emotion. Emily's mother collapsed in her husband's arms, sobbing not with relief, but with the terrible permanence of knowing her daughter was gone and would never receive a proper burial. Because that's the secondary cruelty of these cases, the ones where bodies are never recovered. The families are left in a particular kind of limbo, unable to hold funerals, unable to visit graves, unable to complete the rituals that help the living process death. Emily's mother would sometimes wake in the night, gripped by the irrational hope that maybe Marcus hadn't killed her, maybe Emily really had run away, maybe she would still come home. But rational thought always reasserted itself in the morning light. Emily was gone. Marcus had taken her, and he had hidden her so well that she might never be found. The case prompted changes in how missing person investigations were conducted in the county, particularly involving young adults who disappeared under suspicious circumstances. It sparked conversations about grooming, about age gap relationships, about the warning signs that communities miss when predators are skilled at maintaining respectable facades. For Emily's family, none of these changes mattered. They had lost their daughter to a man they'd invited into her life, a man they trusted to guide her. They would spend the rest of their lives carrying that weight, wondering what they'd missed, whether they could have protected her if they'd been paying closer attention. The question of where Emily's body lies remains unanswered. Marcus has never admitted to killing her, has never revealed what he did or where she is. This final act of control, this withholding of information that would allow a family to grieve properly, is perhaps the cruelest thing of all. The story of Emily Hartwell is a reminder that danger often wears a familiar face, that the people we trust most have the greatest capacity to harm us because we've lowered our defenses, because we've given them access to our vulnerabilities, because we've believed their promises of care and protection. It's a story about how grooming works, how slowly and methodically predators can isolate their victims, and how difficult it can be to recognize abuse when it's disguised as concern. But it's also a story about language, about how the words we use can reveal truth even when we're trying to hide it, about how forensic linguistics has become a powerful tool in modern investigations, about how nothing we write is ever truly private or truly erased. Most importantly, it's a story about a young woman who had dreams, who wrote songs about feelings she was still learning to understand, who deserved the chance to grow into whoever she might have become. Emily Hartwell's life was stolen from her, and while her killer sits in a cell, her absence echoes through a family that will never be whole again. As we move into our next story, the themes shift slightly, but the core truth remains the same. Trust is a gift we give to others, and when that gift is betrayed, the damage extends far beyond the immediate victim. It ripples outward, touching everyone in its path, changing how we see the world and the people in it. Sometimes the danger isn't just hiding in plain sight. Sometimes it's hiding in plain place, in the very location where we're searching, behind walls and doors we assume have already been checked, in spaces we think are empty because we've decided they must be. Lily Moore was 12 years old when she disappeared from a residential street in the middle of a bright Saturday afternoon. Unlike Emily's case, where the victim vanished in darkness and solitude, Lily's disappearance happened in full daylight, in a neighborhood where children played in yards and neighbors knew each other by name. It should have been impossible for a child to vanish under these circumstances. But Lily did vanish, and what made her case particularly haunting was that she was never far from home at all. To understand what happened to Lily, we need to understand the household she lived in and the people who were supposed to keep her safe. Lily had been raised primarily by her grandmother, Ruth Calder, since the age of 6. Lily's mother had struggled with addiction, cycling in and out of treatment programs and halfway houses, appearing in her daughter's life sporadically, always promising to get clean and be a real mother, but never managing to sustain sobriety long enough to make it happen. Lily had learned not to rely on these promises, had learned to find stability in her grandmother's small brick house on Maple Street. Ruth was 62, a retired elementary school teacher who had raised her own children in this same house decades earlier. She was practical, no nonsense, the kind of woman who believed in routine and discipline and vegetables with every meal. She loved Lily fiercely but wasn't particularly demonstrative about it, expressing care through packed lunches and enforced bedtimes rather than hugs and emotional conversations. 3 years before Lily disappeared, Ruth had started dating Neil Ward. Neil was 58, a divorced truck driver who'd recently retired and was looking for companionship in his later years. He seemed kind enough, if a bit quiet. He helped Ruth with household repairs, joined her for church on Sundays, made her laugh with corny jokes. Ruth, who had been widowed for a decade and hadn't expected to find companionship again, was grateful for his presence. Neil moved into the house a year after they started dating. Lily, by then 9 years old, was consulted about this decision in the way children are consulted about things adults have already decided, asked for her opinion, but not really given a choice. She said she didn't mind. Neil had always been polite to her, if a bit awkward. He wasn't trying to replace her grandfather, wasn't trying to be her father. He was just Ruth's boyfriend who now lived in their house. But Lily's friends at school noticed that she talked about Neil less and less over time. When they came over to play, she would steer them away from rooms where Neil might be, preferring to stay outside or in her bedroom. She never articulated why, and her friends, being children themselves, didn't press the issue. Ruth noticed nothing amiss. Neil was helpful, considerate, reliable. He drove Lily to school when Ruth had early morning appointments. He attended her school concerts and clapped in all the right places. He never raised his voice or his hand to the child. Ruth considered herself lucky to have found such a stable, decent man. What Ruth didn't know, what no one knew, was that Neil had installed small cameras in Lily's bedroom and bathroom, hidden in smoke detectors and alarm clocks. These cameras fed to a laptop he kept locked in a toolbox in the garage. He watched the footage late at night when Ruth was asleep, building a collection of images that represented a sickness he'd hidden his entire life. Neil Ward was a predator who had learned patience, who had cultivated a benign persona specifically to gain access to children, who had chosen Ruth not because he loved her, but because she came with a granddaughter. Lily knew something was wrong long before she had words for it. She felt watched in her own room, felt unsafe in her own home. She started changing clothes in her closet, started taking showers as quickly as possible. She became more withdrawn, more anxious. Ruth attributed this to adolescence, to the normal turbulence of a girl approaching her teenage years. On the morning of June 14th, a Saturday, Lily asked if she could walk to her friend Emma's house 6 blocks away. Ruth said yes, reminding her to be home by dinner. Neil was in the garage, ostensibly organizing tools. As Lily walked past on her way out, he looked up and smiled. She did not smile back. Emma would later tell police that Lily never arrived at her house that day. She'd waited for half an hour, sent several texts that went unanswered, then assumed Lily had changed her mind or gotten in trouble and couldn't come. When dinner time came and Lily hadn't returned home, Ruth called Emma's house first, speaking to Emma's mother, learning that Lily had never arrived. A cold dread settled in Ruth's stomach. She called Lily's phone repeatedly, each call going straight to voicemail. She and Neil got in the car and drove the route Lily would have walked, looking for any sign of her. By 8 o'clock, Ruth had called the police. By 9 o'clock, a search was underway. Neighbors emerged from their homes to help look, flashlights cutting through the gathering darkness. They searched yards, alleys, checked with every household on the route Lily would have taken. No one had seen her. The police response was immediate and thorough, treating this as a stranger abduction given Lily's age and the fact that she disappeared in broad daylight. Officers went door to door, conducting interviews, checking security cameras, building a timeline of the afternoon's events. They searched Ruth's house as part of protocol, looking through Lily's room for any indication of where she might have gone, any sign of plans to run away. Ruth and Neil stood in the living room while officers moved through their home, opening closets, checking under beds, looking in the basement. But they didn't check the attic. The attic access was a pull-down ladder in the garage, and when officers asked about it, Neil said it was just storage, nothing up there but Christmas decorations and old furniture. The officers, focused on more likely locations, accepted this and moved on. The search continued through the night and into Sunday. Volunteers from across the city showed up to help, forming search parties that combed through nearby parks and wooded areas. Lily's face appeared on news broadcasts, her school photo showing a girl with dark hair and a tentative smile. Ruth was interviewed on camera, her face drawn and pale, begging whoever had taken Lily to bring her back safely. Neil stood beside her, his arm around her shoulders, playing the role of concerned stepfather perfectly. He made statements about wanting Lily home, about the family being incomplete without her. On Sunday afternoon, police searched the house again, this time more thoroughly. They brought in cadaver dogs trained to detect human remains. The dogs alerted in the garage, but also in several rooms of the house, which wasn't unusual in a home where people lived. Scent can linger, can be transferred. The officers checked the obvious places, but once again, they didn't check the attic. The ladder was heavy, awkward to pull down. It didn't look like it had been used recently, and Neil was there, helpful and cooperative, explaining that he'd been meaning to clean out the attic but hadn't gotten around to it, that it was mostly junk up there anyway. It wasn't until Monday, 3 days after Lily's disappearance, that a detective named Marcus Torres began to feel something was wrong with the narrative. He'd been reviewing the timeline, the statements, the search areas. Something was nagging at him, a detail that didn't fit. Neil had been very specific about what was in the attic. Too specific, perhaps, for someone who claimed he hadn't been up there in months. And when Torres asked Ruth about it, she admitted she'd never actually been in the attic herself. It was Neil's domain, where he stored his things from before the relationship. Torres obtained a warrant to search the entire property again, this time with specific attention to areas that might have been overlooked. When they arrived Tuesday morning, Neil wasn't home. He'd left for his usual coffee run. Ruth said, "Should be back any minute." But Torres couldn't wait. He pulled down the attic ladder himself and climbed up with a flashlight, another officer right behind him. The attic was unfinished, just exposed beams and insulation, low enough that Torres had to crouch. It was hot, stifling, the air thick and raw. His flashlight swept across boxes of Christmas decorations, old furniture covered in dust, exactly what Neil had described. And then the beam of his flashlight found Lily. She was in the corner, hidden behind a stack of boxes, covered with a tarp. She had been dead for days, killed shortly after she'd supposedly left for Emma's house. The medical examiner would later determine she'd been strangled, that death had come quickly, that she hadn't suffered long. But she had been in that attic the entire time, while police searched the house, while volunteers scoured the neighborhood, while her grandmother cried on camera begging for her return. Lily had been 30 feet above their heads, hidden by a man who had lived with her, who had gained her family's trust, who had murdered her, and then participated in the search for her body. Neil was arrested within the hour, caught at a gas station trying to leave town. In his truck were clothes, cash, and the laptop containing the videos he'd recorded of Lily. His calm facade crumbled immediately when confronted with the evidence. He asked for a lawyer and said nothing more. The investigation into Neil's background revealed a carefully constructed lie. He had no history of criminal behavior, no prior arrests, no registered sex offender status. But he had moved frequently over the years, leaving jobs and relationships abruptly, always relocating to new towns where no one knew him. Investigators found evidence that Lily wasn't his first victim. In his storage unit, they discovered hard drives containing images of other children, recorded over many years in different homes. Each time, Neil had positioned himself in the lives of single mothers or grandmothers raising children, had made himself useful and trustworthy, had gained access. How many children had he watched? How many had he harmed? These questions would take years to fully answer, as investigators worked backward through Neil's history, trying to connect him to unsolved cases, trying to find other victims. For Ruth Calder, the revelation destroyed her. She had invited this monster into her home, into her granddaughter's life. She had defended him to neighbors who'd vaguely expressed concern about how quickly he'd moved in. She had trusted him completely, and that trust had cost Lily her life. Ruth would never forgive herself, though the fault was not hers. She had done what lonely people do. She had accepted companionship when it was offered, had believed in the goodness of someone who presented himself as good. She had no way of knowing that Neil's kindness was a carefully constructed facade, that his patience was a hunter's patience, that his presence in her life had always been about access to a child. The question that haunted everyone involved in the case was this: why hadn't they found Lily sooner? How had multiple police searches missed a body that was right there, in the house, the whole time? The answer was uncomfortable, but simple. The attic hadn't seemed like a priority. Neil had been cooperative, had given permission to search, had stood there looking concerned while officers went through closets in the basement. His very cooperation had made him seem safe, had made the idea of him hiding a body in his own attic seem absurd. And the ladder to the attic was heavy, awkward, not something that looked like it had been recently used. It would have taken physical effort to get a child's body up there. Officers, working with limited time and focused on more probable scenarios, had made a judgment call. It was a call that cost Lily days in the heat while her family grieved and searched. This failure led to significant changes in search protocols. New guidelines required that all spaces in a residence be physically checked during missing child investigations, regardless of how unlikely they seemed. Training was updated to include case studies like Lily's, to remind officers that predators count on assumptions, on social cooperation, on the fact that we tend not to suspect people who seem helpful and concerned. Neil Ward's trial was brief. The evidence against him was overwhelming. The video footage and the location of Lily's body leaving no room for alternative theories. He pleaded guilty to first-degree murder, sexual exploitation of a minor, and multiple related charges. In exchange for the guilty plea, which spared Ruth the trauma of a trial, he received life without parole. At his sentencing, the judge asked if he had anything to say. Neil looked at Ruth, who sat in the front row with her head bowed, unable to meet his eyes. "I'm sorry," he said, the words hollow and meaningless. "I'm sick. I need help." The judge's response was cold. You'll have the rest of your life to seek that help in prison. You preyed on a child's trust, on this woman's trust, on the trust of a community. You staged a search for a child you'd murdered and hidden in your own home. There is no punishment severe enough for what you've done. Ruth never spoke publicly about the case again after that day. She sold the house on Maple Street, unable to live in a place where her granddaughter had died. She moved across the country to live with her son, Lily's uncle, who helped her navigate the impossible grief of losing a child to violence and the crushing guilt of having unknowingly facilitated that violence. Lily's mother, who had been in treatment when her daughter disappeared, relapsed upon hearing the news and would overdose 6 months later, another casualty of Neil Ward's destruction. The ripples of his crime extended far beyond Lily herself, touching everyone who had loved her, destroying a family system that had been fragile but functioning. The case also raised questions about how predators select their victims and their environments. Neil had specifically chosen a household with a vulnerable child being raised by an aging guardian. He had calculated that Ruth would be grateful for companionship, would not scrutinize him too closely, would give him the access he needed. This pattern of calculated predation is more common than people want to believe. Predators don't announce themselves. They integrate into communities, into families, into positions of trust. They are patient, sometimes waiting years for the right opportunity. They are skilled at reading people, at understanding what others need, and presenting themselves as the answer to those needs. Parents and guardians are taught to warn children about strangers, but statistics show that children are far more likely to be harmed by someone they know, someone who has legitimate access to their lives. The danger isn't usually the person offering candy from a van. It's the coach, the family friend, the new partner, the neighbor who seems so helpful. Lily's story is a reminder to trust our instincts, especially where children are concerned. If a child seems uncomfortable around someone, even if they can't articulate why, that discomfort deserves attention. If someone seems too eager to be alone with children, to help with childcare, to insert themselves into a child's life, those behaviors warrant scrutiny. But it's also a reminder that predators are skilled manipulators who can fool even the most careful guardians. Ruth Calder was an educated woman, a former teacher who had spent her career around children, who understood child development and safety. And still, she missed the signs, because Neil was that good at hiding what he was. The question of how to protect children from predators who are this skilled remains one without perfect answers. Background checks help, but aren't foolproof. Vigilance helps, but can't catch everything. Open communication with children helps, but depends on children being able to recognize and articulate abuse, which young children especially cannot always do. What we can do is remain aware that these predators exist, that they are often the people we least suspect, that trust must be balanced with caution, and that children's safety must always take precedence over adult feelings and social comfort. Lily Moore was 12 years old. She liked reading fantasy novels, baking cookies with her grandmother, playing soccer with her friends. She was beginning to think about who she wanted to be when she grew up, to navigate the complicated territory between childhood and adolescence. She deserved the chance to become whoever she might have been. Instead, she was killed by a man who saw her not as a person but as an object for his gratification, who murdered her when she became a threat to his secret, who hid her body and then helped search for it as though he cared about her return. The evil of what Neil Ward did lies not just in the murder itself, but in the betrayal it represented, in the violation of every principle of protection and care that should exist between adults and children, in the cold calculation that went into every step of his crime. As we move forward into our next story, the landscape shifts again. We leave behind predators who target children and enter territory that is perhaps even more disturbing because of its familiarity. We're going to talk about family violence, about what happens when the people who are supposed to love you most become the people who hurt you, about how children can be turned into killers. Daniel Reed was 42 years old when he died, beaten and burned in his own home by his teenage daughter and her boyfriend. His story is one of custody battles and parental conflict, of rules that felt like control and love that felt like suffocation, of how quickly anger can turn into violence when young people lack the maturity to regulate their emotions. If you're listening to this and finding it heavy, I understand. These stories carry weight, but they're important stories, ones that need to be told with care and respect. If you need to take a break, please do. The stories will be here when you're ready to return. And if you're finding value in this long-form exploration of these cases, please consider subscribing to the channel. Your support helps us continue to create this kind of thoughtful, detailed content. Daniel Reed had been divorced from his wife, Jennifer, for 3 years when he died. The divorce had been bitter, contested, expensive. It centered primarily on custody of their only child, Ava, who was 11 when her parents' marriage ended and 14 when she helped end her father's life. The marriage had been troubled for years before it officially dissolved. Daniel and Jennifer had married young, too young perhaps, brought together by an unexpected pregnancy and the belief that they should try to make it work for the baby's sake. For a while, it had worked, or at least functioned. Daniel was a good provider, working long hours as an IT technician for a local hospital. Jennifer stayed home with Ava, managing the household, volunteering at school, creating the appearance of a stable family life. But beneath the surface, resentments grew. Daniel felt unappreciated, working long hours only to come home to complaints about things he hadn't done. Jennifer felt isolated, stuck in a role she'd never wanted, raising a child essentially alone while her husband disappeared into his work. They communicated less and less, their conversations devolving into logistics and accusations. The breaking point came when Jennifer met someone else, a man who made her feel seen in ways Daniel hadn't in years. The affair was brief and ended badly, but it destroyed what remained of the marriage. Daniel filed for divorce, hurt and angry, determined to maintain custody of Ava as a way of both protecting her and punishing Jennifer. The custody battle revealed the worst in both parents. Each accused the other of being unfit, of caring more about winning than about what was best for Ava. Lawyers encouraged antagonism, knowing that conflict meant more billable hours. Court-appointed psychologists interviewed Ava repeatedly, asking her to choose between her parents in ways that no child should have to. The final custody arrangement gave Daniel primary custody, with Jennifer receiving visitation every other weekend and Wednesday evenings. This arrangement devastated Jennifer, who felt she'd been punished for a mistake, who believed Daniel had used his financial resources to secure a better lawyer, a more favorable outcome. For Ava, caught between her parents' anger, the arrangement meant living primarily with her father in a house that felt increasingly like a prison. Daniel, hurt by the divorce and determined to be a good father, established strict rules. He monitored Ava's phone, checked her homework every night, required that she be home by 6 o'clock on school nights, approved her friends before she was allowed to spend time with them. These rules, which Daniel saw as responsible parenting, felt to Ava like suffocation. She was 14, navigating the already complicated territory of adolescence, desperate for independence and autonomy. Her father's rules felt arbitrary and cruel, especially when compared to the freedom her friends seemed to have. She started lying to him, small lies at first. She said she was at the library when she was actually at a friend's house. She said she was studying when she was on social media. Daniel, who had installed monitoring software on her devices, caught these lies and responded with more restrictions, tighter control. The cycle escalated. The more Daniel controlled, the more Ava rebelled. The more Ava rebelled, the more Daniel felt justified in his restrictions. Neither of them knew how to break the pattern, how to have honest conversations about what they each needed. And then Ava met Evan Cole. Evan was 17, a senior at the high school Ava attended as a freshman. He was handsome in that particular way teenage boys can be, all cheekbones and attitude, doing poorly in school but not seeming to care, projecting an air of not needing anyone or anything. To Ava, who felt controlled and misunderstood, Evan represented freedom. Their relationship began secretly. They'd text late at night when Daniel thought Ava was asleep. They'd meet between classes, stealing moments in empty hallways. Evan told Ava she was mature for her age, that she didn't deserve to be treated like a child, that her father was unreasonable and controlling. When Daniel discovered the relationship, his response was immediate and severe. Evan was too old for Ava, the age gap inappropriate for a 14-year-old. He forbade Ava from seeing Evan, threatened to have him charged with statutory rape if the relationship continued, monitored Ava's movements even more closely. To Ava, this felt like the ultimate betrayal, proof that her father didn't care about her happiness, that he wanted to control every aspect of her life. She and Evan continued seeing each other in secret, meeting in places Daniel wouldn't think to look, communicating through apps he didn't know about. And as their relationship deepened, fueled by the intensity of forbidden love and shared resentment, they began to talk about how unfair it all was, how Ava's father was ruining her life, how nothing would change until he wasn't in the picture anymore. At first, these were just fantasies, the kind of dark wishes that people don't really mean. They talked about Ava running away, about waiting until she turned 18, about her going to live with her mother. But Daniel had already made clear that he would fight any attempt to modify custody, that he saw himself as saving Ava from her mother's bad influence. The conversations grew darker. They talked about what life would be like if Daniel just wasn't there anymore. If he died, Ava would go to live with her mother. She'd be free. They could be together without hiding. These conversations happened over weeks, the idea becoming more concrete each time it was voiced. They researched how to make it look like an accident, reading about house fires and carbon monoxide poisoning, about staged burglaries and falls downstairs. They were children playing with ideas too big for them to truly comprehend, not understanding that talking about murder, even hypothetically, was already crossing a line, was already moving them toward action. On the night of March 8th, Daniel came home from work at his usual time, around 6:30. Ava was in her room, or so he thought. He heated up leftover pasta, ate dinner alone at the kitchen table while scrolling through news on his tablet, cleaned up his dishes. He never saw Evan, who had been hiding in Ava's closet for the past 3 hours, waiting for the signal. Ava came downstairs around 8 o'clock. "Dad," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "Can we talk?" Daniel looked up, surprised. Ava had barely spoken to him in weeks beyond necessary communication. "Sure," he said, setting down his tablet. "What's going on?" "I'm sorry," Ava said, and for a moment, Daniel felt hope that maybe they were finally going to break through the wall between them. "I'm sorry about everything." He stood up, took a step toward his daughter, arms opening for a hug he'd been missing for months. And that's when Evan came down the stairs behind him, a baseball bat from the garage in his hands. The attack was brutal and disorganized, the violence of young people who had never hurt anyone before, who had thought about it in the abstract but hadn't prepared for the reality. Evan's first swing hit Daniel in the shoulder, sending him stumbling. Daniel, confused and terrified, tried to turn, to understand what was happening. "Ava," he said, looking at his daughter, trying to make sense of why Evan Cole was in his house, why he had a bat, what was happening. Ava stood frozen, watching her father bleeding, watching Evan raise the bat again. In that moment, she could have stopped it. She could have called 911, could have screamed, could have thrown herself between them. Instead, she did nothing. Evan struck again, and Daniel fell, trying to protect his head with his arms, trying to crawl toward the door. But Ava blocked his path, standing there while her boyfriend beat her father into unconsciousness. The silence after was terrible. Daniel lay on the kitchen floor, blood pooling beneath his head, his breathing shallow and rattling. Evan dropped the bat, his hands shaking, staring at what he'd done. Ava stared too, shock and horror dawning on her face as the reality crashed through the fantasy. "We have to call an ambulance," she said, her voice high and thin. "We have to help him." "No," Evan said, grabbing her arm. "We can't. They'll know. We have to finish this." "I can't," Ava said, starting to cry. I can't. But Evan was already moving, fear and adrenaline driving him forward. He'd researched this, knew that fire could destroy evidence, could make it harder to determine cause of death. He went to the garage, found gasoline stored for the lawnmower, brought it into the house. Ava watched him pour it, watched him pull out a lighter. "Please don't," she whispered, but she didn't stop him. When the fire started, they ran. They got in Evan's car and drove with no destination in mind, just away, anywhere away from what they'd done. The fire department arrived within minutes, neighbors having called as soon as they saw flames. They found Daniel Reed still alive, barely, pulled him from the burning kitchen. He died in the ambulance on the way to the hospital, his injuries too severe, the smoke inhalation too extensive. Police knew immediately this wasn't an accidental fire. The gasoline accelerant was obvious. The injuries to Daniel's body, even burned, showed evidence of blunt force trauma. And Ava was missing, her room empty, her phone location sharing turned off. An amber alert went out. Within hours, Evan's car was spotted at a rest stop 200 miles away. Police surrounded it, guns drawn, finding two terrified teenagers who surrendered without resistance. In custody, separated and scared, both Ava and Evan confessed. Their stories matched in the broad strokes, but differed in the details. Each blamed the other for the idea, for pushing it from fantasy to reality. Evan said Ava had manipulated him, had begged him to free her from her abusive father. Ava said Evan had been the driving force, that she'd been scared of him, that she'd gone along because she thought he'd hurt her too if she refused. The truth, as investigators pieced it together from text messages and internet search histories, was that they'd been equally involved in planning, equally committed to the idea of removing Daniel from their lives. The only difference was that Evan had wielded the bat while Ava had watched. Both were charged as adults with first-degree murder, arson, and conspiracy. The prosecution argued that the premeditation was clear, that this wasn't a crime of passion but a calculated killing that they'd planned over weeks. The defense argued that they were children, their brains not fully developed, unable to truly understand the permanence of what they were doing. The legal proceedings were complicated by their ages. Ava was 14, Evan 17. Both had clean records before this. Both came from troubled backgrounds. Ava with her bitter custody battle, Evan with an absent father and a mother struggling with addiction. The case became a focal point for debates about how the justice system should handle juveniles who commit serious crimes. Should they be tried as adults, held fully accountable for actions they may not have had the maturity to truly comprehend? Or should they be sent through the juvenile system, with the possibility of rehabilitation and release when they turn 21? In the end, both accepted plea deals. Evan pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to 40 years to life. Ava pleaded guilty to manslaughter and arson, receiving 25 years to life. Both would be eligible for parole eventually, but the likelihood of release was slim given the nature of their crimes. At Ava's sentencing, Jennifer, her mother, gave a statement that reduced most of the courtroom to tears. She talked about a system that had failed her family, about a custody battle that had prioritized winning over healing, about how she tried to tell the court that the arrangement wasn't working, that Ava needed therapy, that Daniel's controlling behavior was damaging. "I'm not excusing what my daughter did," Jennifer said, her voice breaking. "What she did was monstrous and unforgivable. But she didn't get there alone. The system that tore our family apart, that pitted us against each other, that turned custody into a battleground, that system failed all of us. And now my ex-husband is dead, and my daughter is a murderer, and I have to live with the knowledge that maybe if we'd all been forced into family therapy instead of litigation, none of this would have happened." Daniel's family gave statements too, talking about a man who had loved his daughter, who had been trying his best as a single parent, who didn't deserve to die in terror and pain at the hands of the child he'd devoted his life to raising. Both things were true. Daniel had loved Ava. His rules had come from a place of caring, of wanting to protect her from making the mistakes he'd made, from getting hurt. But his love had been expressed through control, and Ava had experienced that control as oppression. This doesn't justify what Ava and Evan did. Murder is never justified, and the premeditation in their case made it particularly heinous. But it does complicate the narrative, makes us question how we got here, what warning signs were missed, what interventions might have prevented this tragedy. Ava Reed is now 19 years old, serving her sentence in a women's correctional facility. She will not be eligible for parole until she is 39. By the time she might be released, she will have spent more of her life in prison than she spent free. Her childhood, her adolescence, her young adulthood, all of it will have happened behind bars. Evan Cole is 22, in a maximum security prison, where he will likely spend the rest of his life. The teenage boy who thought he was in love, who thought violence was the solution to an inconvenient problem, is now a man living with the reality of having ended another person's life. The question that haunts everyone who studies this case is whether it was preventable. The warning signs were there. The texts between Ava and Evan, if anyone had seen them, clearly showed escalating talk of violence. Ava's behavioral changes, her increasing resentment toward her father, her secret relationship with an older boy, all of these were red flags. But Daniel was a single parent doing his best, working full-time, trying to manage a hostile relationship with his ex-wife, trying to set boundaries with a teenage daughter who fought him on everything. He missed the signs because he was overwhelmed, because he thought he was doing the right thing by being strict, because he never imagined his daughter was capable of what she ultimately did. The case prompted discussions about adolescent brain development, about how teenagers process risk and consequence differently than adults, about how easily influenced they are by peer pressure and romantic relationships. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for judgment and impulse control, isn't fully developed until the mid-20s. This doesn't excuse violent behavior, but it does explain why teenagers sometimes make catastrophically bad decisions without fully grasping the permanent nature of the consequences. It also prompted discussions about how we handle custody disputes, about whether courts prioritize the wrong things, about whether forced family therapy should be part of all contentious divorces involving children. Some jurisdictions have since implemented policies requiring counseling for families going through difficult custody battles, though enforcement is inconsistent. For the people who knew Daniel Reed, the loss was profound. Coworkers described him as dedicated and kind, someone who always had time to help solve a technical problem. Neighbors remembered him as quiet but friendly, someone who kept his lawn neat and always returned borrowed tools. His family remembered a son and brother who had been dealt a hard hand in his marriage but was trying to do right by his daughter. None of them imagined he would die the way he did, at the hands of the child he'd loved most in the world. The story of Daniel, Ava, and Evan is a reminder that family violence is often the most complicated kind, tangled in histories and hurts that outsiders can never fully understand. It's a story about how anger can build slowly, how resentment can be nurtured until it feels justified, how young people with underdeveloped judgment can convince themselves that terrible actions are not just acceptable but necessary. It's also a story about how adults, even well-meaning ones, can fail to see when children are in crisis, when the discipline meant to protect has become the thing they need protection from. It doesn't excuse murder, but it asks us to think about how we create environments where children feel heard, where conflicts can be resolved without violence, where asking for help is possible. As we shift into our fourth story, we move from the chaos of family violence to something quieter but no less devastating. We're going to talk about marriage, about the secrets people keep from their spouses, about how betrayal can turn to murder when the person who made vows decides those vows are less important than protecting themselves. Sarah Collins was 36 years old when her husband killed her, and by all accounts, she had no idea it was coming. Sarah was a special education teacher at an elementary school in a suburb outside Portland. She had been teaching for 12 years and was beloved by students, parents, and colleagues. She had a gift for reaching children others had given up on, for seeing potential where others saw only problems. She was patient, creative, endlessly kind. Her classroom was a place of structured chaos, filled with sensory tools and visual schedules, with fidget toys and weighted blankets, with systems designed to help children who struggled with traditional learning environments. Parents of her students often said that Sarah had changed their children's lives, had given them confidence and skills they'd thought their kids would never develop. Outside of work, Sarah was quiet and private. She had a small circle of friends, mostly other teachers, with whom she occasionally went to dinner or saw movies. She was close to her parents, who lived 2 hours away and visited monthly. She loved hiking and photography, spending her weekends exploring trails and capturing images of the natural world. She had been married to Michael Collins for 8 years. They'd met through a mutual friend, dated for 2 years before getting engaged, had a small wedding at a vineyard. To everyone who knew them, they seemed happy, stable, compatible. They weren't dramatic or effusive in their affection, but they seemed solid, like they'd built something real together. What no one knew, what Sarah herself didn't discover until weeks before her death, was that Michael was living a double life. Michael worked in pharmaceutical sales, a job that required travel several days a month to meet with clients and attend conferences. This travel gave him cover for a secret he'd been keeping for most of their marriage. He was having affairs. Not just one affair, which might be understood as a mistake or a moment of weakness, but multiple affairs over years, with different women in different cities. He maintained these relationships carefully, juggling schedules and stories, keeping them separate from each other and from Sarah. He was meticulous about it, using a second phone that Sarah never knew existed, maintaining separate email accounts, paying for hotels and dinners with credit cards Sarah never saw statements for. He had constructed an elaborate system of lies, and it had worked perfectly for years. But systems like this always fail eventually. The first crack appeared when one of Michael's girlfriends, a woman named Jessica who he'd been seeing for 2 years in Seattle, got pregnant. She told Michael she was keeping the baby and expected him to be involved. Michael, panicking, told her he needed time to figure things out, that the situation was complicated. Jessica, confused by his reluctance, did some research and discovered Michael was married. She found Sarah's Facebook page, saw the photos of Michael and Sarah hiking together, celebrating anniversaries, looking for all the world like a happy couple. Jessica was hurt and angry. She'd believed Michael's story that he was single, that they were building toward a future together. Discovering she'd been lied to, that she was the other woman without knowing it, devastated her. She sent Sarah a message on Facebook. It was detailed and specific, including dates and locations, screenshots of texts between her and Michael, photos they'd taken together. There was no way to dismiss it as a mistake or a misunderstanding. The evidence was overwhelming. Sarah read the message on a Tuesday afternoon, sitting in her classroom after the students had left for the day. Her hands shook as she scrolled through the evidence of her husband's betrayal. When she got to the part about the pregnancy, she felt physically ill. She went home that night and confronted Michael. His first response was to deny everything, to claim Jessica was crazy, a stalker, someone he'd met once who had become obsessed with him. But when Sarah showed him the screenshots, the photos, the specific details Jessica had provided, his story fell apart. He admitted to the affair with Jessica, but claimed it was the only one, a terrible mistake he regretted. Sarah wanted to believe him, wanted to think this was an isolated incident, something they could recover from with therapy in time. But she couldn't quite believe him. His denials had been too smooth, too practiced. She asked for access to his phone, his computer, his credit card statements. Michael, realizing he had no choice, agreed. What Sarah found destroyed her. The evidence of multiple affairs, going back years, with at least 5 different women. Money spent on hotel rooms and gifts. Thousands of dollars that should have been going into their joint savings. Emails making plans, making promises, building relationships that were just as real as his marriage to her. She confronted him with all of it. Michael, cornered, finally admitted everything. He tried to explain, said he didn't know why he did it, that he loved Sarah, but something was wrong with him, that he needed help. Sarah told him to leave. She said she needed time to think, to process, to decide whether their marriage could survive this. Michael moved out to a hotel, promising to give her space, saying he'd do whatever it took to earn back her trust. But what Michael was really thinking about, in that hotel room, was not how to save his marriage, but how to protect himself. Because there was another secret he hadn't shared, one even more damaging than the affairs. Michael was deep in debt. The money he'd spent on his other relationships, the second phone bills, the separate credit cards, the lavish gifts meant to keep multiple women happy, all of it had been financed with debt. He owed more than $80,000 across multiple credit cards and personal loans, debt Sarah knew nothing about. And there was a life insurance policy on Sarah through her employer, a standard benefit that paid out $500,000 in the event of her death. Michael was the beneficiary. In his hotel room, overwhelmed by the collapse of his carefully constructed lies, facing the prospect of divorce, exposure, financial ruin, Michael began to think about that insurance policy. If Sarah died, the debt would be eliminated. He could start over. He wouldn't have to face the shame of everyone knowing what he'd done. He began researching how to make a murder look like an accident, how to stage a burglary, whether life insurance paid out if the beneficiary was suspected of involvement. He used the hotel's business center computer, thinking it would be harder to trace than his own devices. He was wrong about that, but he didn't know it yet. Sarah, meanwhile, was making her own decisions. She talked to a lawyer about divorce, about protecting her assets, about what her life might look like without Michael. She talked to her parents, who were horrified by what he'd done and supportive of whatever decision she made. She decided to file for divorce. She couldn't trust him, couldn't imagine rebuilding a relationship with someone who had been lying to her for years. She texted Michael telling him her decision, asking him not to contact her directly anymore, saying all communication should go through their lawyers. Michael received this text on a Thursday evening. By Friday afternoon, Sarah was dead. She had stayed late at school that Friday, as she often did, preparing materials for the following week. She left around 7 o'clock, texted a colleague that she was heading home, got in her car. Her neighbor found her 3 hours later. The front door to her house was ajar, which was unusual. Concerned, the neighbor went inside and found Sarah in the living room, stabbed multiple times, clearly dead. Police arrived to what appeared to be a burglary gone wrong. A window was broken, drawers were pulled open, some items appeared to be missing. But experienced detectives immediately noticed inconsistencies. The broken window was broken from the inside, glass falling outward rather than inward. The drawers that were dumped looked staged, contents too carefully strewn. Nothing of significant value was missing. Sarah's laptop was still on the kitchen table, her purse with credit cards still on the counter. And there was too much violence. Sarah had been stabbed 17 times. Burglars who encounter unexpected homeowners typically flee or use minimal force to escape. This was rage, personal, excessive. Police looked at Michael first, as they always do in domestic homicides. He had an alibi. He'd been at the hotel, had ordered room service, had security camera footage showing him in the lobby. But the timeline was tight, just barely enough time to make the alibi work. Investigators obtained warrants for his electronic devices. The search history on the hotel computer was damning. Searches about staging crimes, about life insurance policies, about how police investigate domestic murders. The timing of these searches, all in the days after Sarah asked for a divorce, suggested premeditation. But it was his phone's location data that sealed the case. Despite his alibi, his phone had pinged off a cell tower near Sarah's house at the time of the murder, then traveled back to the hotel. Michael had been there. The room service receipt and security footage had been part of his plan, establishing presence at the hotel while quickly traveling to Sarah's house and back. Confronted with this evidence, Michael's attorney advised him to cooperate. Michael confessed to everything. He described planning the murder, waiting until Sarah was home, breaking the window from inside after killing her to stage a burglary. He said he'd panicked, that the reality of what he was doing had hit him as he stabbed her, but by then it was too late to stop. He claimed he'd never meant to hurt her, that he'd just been trying to solve his problems, that everything had spiraled out of control. He showed no real remorse for Sarah's death, only for the fact that he'd been caught. The trial was straightforward. The evidence was overwhelming, the premeditation clear. Michael was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life without parole. Sarah's students, too young to fully understand what had happened, knew only that their beloved teacher wasn't coming back. Her colleagues mourned the loss of someone who had been a light in a difficult profession. Her parents buried their only daughter, destroyed by the knowledge that the man they'd welcomed into their family had stolen her from them. The case became a reminder that the person you marry, the person you think you know most intimately, can be a stranger hiding in plain sight. Michael had fooled Sarah for 8 years. He had fooled her parents, her friends, everyone who knew them as a couple. He had maintained a facade so complete that when it cracked, it revealed someone Sarah had never known at all. What makes Michael's crime particularly chilling is the coldness of it, the calculation. He didn't kill Sarah in a moment of rage or passion. He planned it, researched it, staged it, all while maintaining the appearance of a husband willing to work on their marriage. He looked her in the eye and promised to give her space while plotting her murder. For the people who cared about Sarah, the betrayal was multi-layered. The affairs were terrible enough, the lies about who he was. But to know that when confronted with the consequences of his choices, Michael's response was to end Sarah's life rather than accept responsibility. That was a depth of selfishness and cruelty that felt incomprehensible. The case also highlighted how life insurance can become a motive for murder in failing marriages. While insurance is meant to provide financial security for grieving families, it can also create terrible incentives when relationships deteriorate and financial pressures mount. Financial stress is one of the leading causes of both divorce and domestic violence. When someone is deeply in debt, facing exposure and shame, the thought of a large insurance payout can become dangerously appealing. It's a motive as old as insurance itself, but it remains shockingly effective at driving people to commit murder. Sarah Collins deserved better than what happened to her. She deserved a husband who honored his vows, who was honest about who he was, who took responsibility for his choices instead of murdering her to avoid consequences. She deserved to continue teaching children who needed her, to hike her trails, to live the quiet, good life she'd built. Instead, She became another statistic, another woman killed by an intimate partner, another case that reminds us how dangerous it can be to trust someone who is committed to deception. Her legacy lives on in the students she taught, in the educational approaches she pioneered, in the lives she touched during her too short time as a teacher. Her school named their special education resource room after her, a small memorial that ensures her name will be spoken with respect and gratitude for years to come. But her parents will never recover from this loss. No memorial, no conviction, no sentence will bring their daughter back or ease the pain of knowing that she died afraid and alone, betrayed by the person who promised to love and protect her. As we move into our final story, we shift once more, this time to a case about civic duty, about what happens when doing the right thing puts you in the crosshairs of people who have nothing to lose. Thomas Bennett, known to everyone as Tom, was 53 years old when he died. He was a systems engineer, the kind of person who made complex technologies work smoothly behind the scenes, whose competence meant most people never knew his name but benefited from his work every day. Tom lived in a suburban neighborhood in Charlotte, North Carolina, in a tidy split-level house he'd owned for 15 years. He was divorced, his ex-wife having moved to Florida after their children were grown. He had 2 adult children, both launched into their own lives, both living in other states. Tom was okay with his quiet life, his routine, his solitude. He was a good neighbor, the kind who would lend tools without asking when they'd be returned, who would bring in your trash cans if you forgot, who would call if your garage door was left open overnight. He kept his property neat, shoveled the sidewalks in winter even beyond his own house, waved to people he passed on his evening walks. Tom was not the kind of person who sought out excitement or risk. He paid his bills on time, followed traffic laws, voted in every election. He was, in the best sense, an unremarkable citizen whose unremarkableness made the community function smoothly. It was this civic-mindedness that led to his death. On an April evening, Tom was working in his garage when he heard a crash from the house next door. His neighbors, the Hendersons, were an elderly couple in their 70s. Tom had shoveled their driveway last winter when Mr. Henderson was recovering from hip surgery. He checked on them occasionally, knowing they lived alone. The crash sounded wrong, not like something dropped, but like glass breaking, like forced entry. Tom stepped out of his garage and saw the Hendersons' side door standing open, saw movement inside the house through the windows. He knew the Hendersons were supposed to be at their daughter's house that evening, celebrating a birthday. Someone was in their house who shouldn't be. Tom did exactly what he'd been taught to do his entire life. He called 911. "I'm reporting a burglary in progress," he told the dispatcher, giving the address, describing what he'd seen. The dispatcher told him to stay on the line, to stay in his own house, that police were on the way. Tom stayed on the phone, watching from his window as 2 figures emerged from the Hendersons' house carrying a television and a laptop. The dispatcher asked if he could describe them. 2 males, both black, late teens or early 20s. One's wearing a red hoodie, the other has on a black jacket. They're putting stuff in a blue sedan, looks like a Honda. The dispatcher relayed this information to responding officers. Tom, still on the phone, watched as the burglars got in their car and drove away. He provided the license plate number. "You did great," the dispatcher told him. "Officers will be there in about 3 minutes to get a full statement." Tom gave his statement to the police, provided everything he'd observed, signed a witness form. The officers thanked him for being observant, for calling it in, for being willing to testify if needed. Tom said, of course, it was the right thing to do. The burglars were identified quickly from the license plate and arrested the next day. They were Jalen Brooks, 19, and Marcus Lane, 21. Both had prior arrests for property crimes. The evidence against them was solid. The stolen property recovered from the car, Tom's eyewitness account, their fingerprints in the Hendersons' house. They were charged with burglary and held on bond. Marcus Lane made bail quickly, posted by a family member. Jalen Brooks couldn't afford bail and remained in custody. That's when the jail calls started. Jails record all phone calls made by inmates, a policy that's clearly posted and that all inmates acknowledge. These recordings are stored and can be reviewed by investigators if needed. What Marcus and Jalen didn't realize or didn't care about was that their conversations about the witness were being preserved. "We got to take care of this before trial," Marcus said in one call. "That neighbor who called the cops, he's the only one who can ID us. I know his address, Jalen responded. Same street as the house we hit. So we know where to find him. The calls continued over weeks, the threats becoming more specific. They talked about the exact house, about Tom's schedule that they'd observed during their surveillance of the neighborhood before the burglary. They discussed whether to make it look like a burglary or just send a message to anyone else thinking about testifying. They talked about guns, about getting Marcus's cousin involved, about the timing. All of this was recorded. All of this was available to law enforcement. But the system designed to review these calls was overwhelmed. Thousands of hours of recorded conversations, limited staff to review them, prioritization given to ongoing violent crimes and terrorism threats. The calls discussing Tom sat in a queue, flagged by automated keyword detection, but not reviewed by human analysts. By the time someone would have gotten to them, it was too late. Tom, meanwhile, knew nothing about these threats. He hadn't been informed that the burglars were discussing him. Witness protection protocols for property crime cases were minimal. He was just a citizen who'd done his civic duty, going about his normal life. Marcus made bail 6 weeks after the burglary. One of the first things he did upon release was meet with Jalen's cousin, who provided a handgun. The second thing he did was drive to Tom's neighborhood to confirm which house was his. On a Tuesday evening in late June, Tom was at home after work, microwaving dinner, planning to watch a baseball game. At 7:43 p.m., someone knocked on his front door. Tom, expecting maybe a neighbor or a delivery, opened the door without checking the peephole. Marcus Lane was standing there, the gun already raised. "This is for snitching," Marcus said, and fired 3 times. Tom died on his front porch, his dinner burning forgotten in the microwave, the baseball game starting on the television he'd never sit down to watch. Neighbors heard the shots and called 911. Police arrived within minutes, but Marcus was already gone, the blue Honda sedan spotted leaving the neighborhood at high speed. The investigation into Tom's murder was swift. The detective assigned to the case reviewed Tom's life, looking for enemies, for anyone who might want him dead. Tom's ex-wife, his children, his co-workers all said the same thing. He was a kind, quiet man who kept to himself, who had no conflicts with anyone. But Tom had recently been a witness in a burglary case. The detective pulled the file, saw that both defendants had been released on bail, and immediately understood what had happened. Within hours, they had warrants for Marcus Lane and Jalen Brooks. Marcus was arrested at his girlfriend's apartment. Jalen was still in jail on the original burglary charge, but was now looking at murder conspiracy charges. And then investigators discovered the jail call recordings. The calls were damning, providing clear evidence of premeditation, of conspiracy, of intent to kill a witness. They detailed the entire plan, from identification of the target to acquisition of the weapon to the execution of the murder. The question everyone immediately asked was, why weren't these calls reviewed sooner? Why was a witness allowed to remain unprotected when clear threats against him existed in recorded form? The answer was systemic failure. The jail recorded thousands of calls daily. The automated flagging system had worked. Tom's name and address in connection with violent keywords had triggered alerts. But the backlog of flagged calls was so extensive that Tom's case hadn't been prioritized. Property crime witness threats were lower priority than active violent crime investigations. By the time the calls would have been reviewed through normal procedures, Tom was already dead. The revelation of these unreviewed calls sparked public outrage. A man had done his civic duty, had reported a crime, and the system had failed to protect him despite having specific knowledge of threats against his life. The Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department faced intense criticism, as did the county jail system and the district attorney's office. Changes were implemented. Enhanced witness notification protocols, expedited review of any jail calls mentioning witnesses by name, mandatory witness protection assessments for all cases involving defendants released on bail. These changes came too late for Tom Bennett, but might protect future witnesses. Marcus Lane and Jalen Brooks were both charged with first-degree murder, witness tampering, and conspiracy. The evidence against them was overwhelming. The jail calls, the gun recovered from Marcus's possession matched to the ballistics from the scene, surveillance footage showing Marcus's car in Tom's neighborhood. Both were convicted and sentenced to life without parole. At sentencing, the judge addressed them directly. Thomas Bennett was a good man who did what we teach citizens to do: report crimes, cooperate with law enforcement, participate in the justice system. You killed him not because he wronged you personally, but because he fulfilled his civic duty. You killed him to intimidate other witnesses, to undermine the justice system itself. In doing so, you've earned the harshest punishment available. Tom's children gave victim impact statements describing a father who'd taught them to do the right thing, who'd modeled citizenship and responsibility. They expressed anger not just at the killers, but at the system that had failed to protect their father despite having warning of the threats against him. The case became a focal point for discussions about witness protection, about the resources dedicated to reviewing jail calls, about the balance between prosecuting property crimes and protecting the witnesses who make those prosecutions possible. It also became a cautionary tale about the risks of civic participation. In the neighborhood where Tom died, several residents admitted they would think twice before calling police to report crimes, fearful of retaliation. This chilling effect, where witnesses refuse to cooperate because they fear for their safety, is exactly what Marcus and Jalen intended to create. But it's also what makes their crimes so pernicious. If witnesses can't safely report crimes, if cooperation with law enforcement becomes life-threatening, then the entire justice system breaks down. Communities become lawless, criminals operate with impunity, and decent people live in fear. Tom Bennett deserved better. He deserved to live a long, quiet life, to watch baseball games and tinker in his garage and grow old annoying his neighbors with his helpfulness. He deserved a system that protected him after he'd done his part to protect his community. Instead, he died because he'd been taught to do the right thing, because he trusted that the system would work, because he believed that civic duty mattered. His death stands as an indictment of a system that failed to prioritize his safety, that let threats against him languish in a queue while he went about his life unaware that he'd been marked for death. But it also stands as a testament to the importance of witnesses, of citizens who refuse to look away when crimes happen, who believe in community and responsibility even when it's risky. Tom Bennett's willingness to report what he saw, to testify if needed, to participate in the justice system represents the best of civic virtue. That virtue should be protected, honored, supported by every level of law enforcement and the courts. When we fail to protect witnesses, we fail the entire foundation of justice. The changes implemented after Tom's death, the expedited call reviews, the enhanced protection protocols, the mandatory threat assessments, are his legacy. They won't bring him back, but they might save future witnesses from the same fate. For Tom's children, no policy change can ease the grief of losing their father to senseless violence. They struggle with anger at the killers, at the system that failed him, at the randomness of it all. Tom had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. A good neighbor to people who happened to be targeted by criminals who happened to be caught because of Tom's call, who happened to be the kind of people willing to commit murder to avoid prosecution. So many contingencies, so many moments where things could have gone differently. If the Hendersons had been home that night, the burglary wouldn't have happened. If Tom had been inside his house instead of in the garage, he wouldn't have heard the break-in. If he'd decided not to call, or if he'd given a less detailed description, or if he'd declined to sign the witness statement, any of these choices would have saved his life. But Tom Bennett was raised to believe in doing the right thing, in being a good neighbor, in contributing to the safety of his community. He couldn't have made different choices and still been the person he was. And that's the tragedy. Tom died because of his virtues, not his flaws. He died because he was exactly the kind of citizen we need more of, the kind who takes responsibility, who acts when action is needed, who believes in the social contract. Marcus Lane and Jalen Brooks will spend the rest of their lives in prison, which is just. But justice for Tom isn't really possible. You can't restore a life once it's taken. You can't undo murder. You can only try to prevent it from happening again, to learn from failures, to build systems that protect rather than fail the people who deserve protection most. As we come to the end of this final story, as we prepare to step back and look at all 5 cases together, I want you to sit with this reality. Doing the right thing sometimes carries terrible costs, but we can't let that stop us from doing right. We can only demand that our systems do better at protecting those who step forward. We've traveled through 5 stories tonight, 5 variations on the theme of trust betrayed and safety shattered. These aren't easy stories. They don't offer simple lessons or comfortable conclusions, but they're important stories, ones that need to be told and remembered. In Emily Hartwell's case, We saw how predators use trust and mentorship to isolate victims, how grooming can be so gradual that it's invisible until it's too late. We saw how forensic linguistics can speak for the dead, how patterns of language can reveal truth even when bodies remain hidden. In Lillymore's case, we confronted the reality that danger often lives inside the home, that predators seek positions of trust specifically to gain access to children. We saw how systemic failures in search protocols can have fatal consequences, how assumptions about what's possible can blind us to what's real. In the case of Daniel Reed and his daughter Ava, we witnessed how family conflict can escalate to murder, how teenagers with underdeveloped judgment can convince themselves that violence is solution, how custody battles can become battlefields that leave everyone wounded. In Sarah Collins's murder, we saw how someone can live a double life for years, how betrayal can compound into murder when consequences loom, how life insurance can become a motive for the most intimate kind of violence. And in Tom Bennett's death, we confronted the terrible cost of civic duty, the ways systems fail to protect those who step forward, the ripple effects when witnesses are killed for cooperating with justice. 5 different stories, 5 different circumstances, 5 different sets of victims and perpetrators. But running through all of them is that single thread we identified at the beginning. Trust as the weapon, familiarity as the danger, the people closest to us having the greatest capacity to harm us. This isn't a comfortable truth. We want to believe that we can trust the people we let into our lives, that our instincts will protect us, that danger will announce itself clearly. But these stories remind us that life is more complicated and more dangerous than that. They also remind us that evil doesn't always look like we expect. Marcus Hale seemed like a respected community member. Neil Ward seemed like a kind boyfriend. Ava Reed was a teenage girl who loved her father before she helped kill him. Michael Collins seemed like a devoted husband. Marcus Lane and Jalen Brooks were teenagers who made a choice that ended a good man's life. None of them fit our stereotypes of what monsters look like. That's what makes them so dangerous, and what makes these stories so important to understand. If there's a lesson here, beyond the specific circumstances of each case, it's this: pay attention to warning signs. Trust your instincts when something feels wrong. Support systems that protect the vulnerable. Demand accountability when systems fail. And remember that the people who harm us are rarely strangers in dark alleys. They're the ones we've invited into our homes, our families, our lives. These 5 people, Emily, Lily, Daniel, Sarah, and Tom, deserve better than what happened to them. They deserve to live full lives, to pursue their dreams, to grow old, to be safe in their own homes and communities. Instead, they became cautionary tales, their names forever linked to the violence that ended their lives. But they were people first, before they were victims. They had favorite songs and foods, quirks and habits, dreams and fears. They were loved and will be missed for the rest of their families' lives. In telling their stories, we honor their memory. We refuse to let them be reduced to statistics or forgotten cases. We insist that their lives mattered, that their deaths mean something, that the lessons learned from their tragedies might protect others. The night is deep now, and we've spent these hours together walking through dark territory. If you're still listening, thank you for staying with these stories, for giving them the attention they deserve. These aren't the kind of stories that end with neat resolutions or satisfying conclusions. They end with grief and absence, with families forever changed, with questions that can't be fully answered. But they also end with awareness, with knowledge, with the recognition that we must do better, individually and collectively, at protecting each other, at recognizing danger even when it wears a familiar face, at building systems that prioritize safety over convenience or cost. As you prepare to sleep, or as you move into the rest of your day, carry these stories with you not as sources of fear, but as reminders of vigilance. The world is not a safe place, but it's not entirely dangerous either. Most people are good. Most relationships are healthy. Most trust is well placed, but some isn't. And the difference between a life lived and a life lost can come down to recognizing that difference, to trusting our instincts, to asking hard questions even when they feel uncomfortable. For those of you who have experienced betrayal or violence from people you trusted, these stories may have been difficult to hear. Please know that what happened to you was not your fault. Predators are skilled at manipulation, at hiding their true nature, at making victims feel complicit in their own victimization. You survived something terrible, and your survival matters. For those of you who have lost loved ones to violence, especially violence perpetrated by someone close to them, I hope these stories have honored the reality of your loss. There are no words adequate to grief like yours, no narratives that can make sense of the senseless. But your loved ones mattered, their lives had value, and they deserved better than what happened to them. For everyone else, I hope these stories have given you something to think about, some framework for understanding how these tragedies happen, how to recognize warning signs, how to support survivors, and remember victims with dignity. The work of understanding violence, of preventing it where possible and responding to it with justice and compassion when prevention fails, is work that belongs to all of us. We are all part of the systems that either protect people or fail them. Our choices matter, our vigilance matters, our willingness to act when we see something wrong matters. Tom Bennett's story, in particular, reminds us of this. He saw something wrong and he acted. He reported a crime, cooperated with police, did everything right. The system failed him, but he did not fail the system. His example, despite its tragic ending, is one we should aspire to. The citizen who steps forward, who participates, who believes in collective responsibility for community safety. We must also commit to protecting people like Tom, to building systems that don't leave witnesses vulnerable, to prioritizing the safety of those who step forward over bureaucratic convenience or resource constraints. This is a matter of moral obligation and practical necessity. Without witnesses, without people willing to report crimes and testify, the justice system cannot function. As we close this long night of stories, I want to return to where we began. The quiet fear that arrives not with strangers, but with familiar faces, the trust that becomes a weapon, the danger that lives inside our circles rather than outside them. This fear is real and justified. The statistics bear it out. Most violence is perpetrated by someone the victim knows. Most murders are committed by family members or intimate partners. Most child abuse happens in homes, by people with legitimate access to children. But we cannot let this reality paralyze us or prevent us from forming connections, from trusting anyone, from building the relationships that make life meaningful. The solution isn't isolation or paranoia. It's mindful trust, trust that's earned gradually, that's balanced with appropriate boundaries, that's revoked when warning signs appear. It's also about building communities where people look out for each other, where neighbors notice when something seems wrong, where children are taught that they can report adults who make them uncomfortable, where victims are believed and supported rather than blamed or doubted. Every one of these 5 cases involved moments where intervention was possible, where someone might have noticed something wrong and acted on it. Sometimes those interventions happened but were ignored or dismissed. Sometimes they didn't happen because people didn't want to interfere, didn't trust their instincts, didn't think it was their business. We must do better at this. We must be willing to have uncomfortable conversations, to ask hard questions, to report concerns even when we're not certain, to support people who are in danger even when it's inconvenient. This doesn't mean being suspicious of everyone or assuming the worst about people. It means being aware, being observant, being willing to act when action is needed. It means teaching children about body autonomy and consent, about recognizing grooming behaviors, about telling trusted adults when something feels wrong. It means believing children when they express discomfort about an adult, even if that adult is family or well-respected in the community. It means paying attention to friends and family members who seem to be in controlling relationships, who are isolated from their support systems, who show signs of abuse. It means offering help even when it's refused, staying connected even when it's difficult, and being there when people are ready to leave dangerous situations. It means being the kind of neighbor Tom Bennett was, observant, willing to act, committed to community safety. And it means demanding that systems protect people like Tom. That civic duty doesn't come with an unacceptable risk of retaliation. These are big asks, systemic changes that require collective will and sustained effort. But they're necessary if we want to prevent more stories like these 5 from unfolding. For now, though, our time together is ending. We've spent these hours in the dark territory of trust betrayed and lives ended. We've honored 5 people who deserved better, who were failed by individuals and systems, whose deaths carry lessons we must learn. Emily Hartwell, Lily Moore, Daniel Reed, Sarah Collins, and Thomas Bennett. Say their names, remember their stories, Carry forward the knowledge that danger often comes from those closest to us, and commit to doing better at recognizing and preventing that danger. Before we close, if you found value in this deep dive into these cases, if you appreciate the time and care taken to tell these stories with respect and nuance, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Your support makes this work possible and helps these stories reach people who need to hear them. Leave a comment sharing where you're from and what time you're listening. There's something powerful about knowing we're all sitting with these stories together, across different time zones and circumstances, united in our commitment to understanding and preventing violence. Share this with someone who might benefit from these stories, who might need to hear that they're not alone in having experienced betrayal from someone they trusted, or who needs to understand how predators operate so they can protect themselves and their loved ones. The conversation doesn't end when the video ends. These stories continue in your thoughts, in your awareness, in the choices you make about who to trust and how to protect yourself and others. Carry them forward thoughtfully. Let them inform your vigilance without creating paranoia. Let them motivate action without breeding cynicism. The world is full of both good and evil, of trustworthy people and those who abuse trust. Our task is to navigate this reality with wisdom, to build communities that protect the vulnerable, to hold accountable those who harm, and to remember that every victim was a person who mattered, whose life had value, whose absence creates a void that can never be filled. Thank you for spending this time with me, for listening to these difficult stories, for honoring these 5 lives with your attention. May you rest well, knowing that awareness is the first step toward prevention, that vigilance is a form of care, and that remembering victims is a way of insisting that their lives and their deaths matter. Sleep well, stay safe, and carry forward the knowledge that trust is precious and should be guarded carefully, that familiarity is not the same as safety, and that doing the right thing, even when it's difficult or dangerous, is what builds the kind of world worth living in. Good night, and may these stories stay with you not as nightmares, but as reminders to pay attention, to trust your instincts, to protect the vulnerable, and to never forget that behind every true crime story is a real person who deserved better than what happened to them.